My parents kicked me out after I refused to look after my brother's children. My brother and his wife moved in with our parents and were upset when I declined to babysit their children while they planned to relax. My parents sided with them, so I moved out and stopped paying their bills. Why is she here? My mother's voice echoed through the grand foyer, sharp and cold, piercing straight into my chest. My father didn't even glance my way. My brother, Vernon, stood beside him, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips, a mix of contempt and amusement. No one spoke my name. Not a single glance acknowledged me as a person with a face, a past, or feelings. My mere presence made all three turn away, as if I were something filthy, out of place, needing immediate removal. I still remember the day they cast me out. Winter, the year I had just turned 17. The ground was frozen, the wind cut like knives. I stood shivering in front of the colonial-style mansion I once called home. In my hand was a worn backpack filled with a few old clothes and $14.82. There was no good luck, no goodbye hug, no one walked me out. My mother, Margaret Ellis, stood behind the curtain, a glass of red wine in her hand, her eyes blank, as if I were a debt finally settled. My father, Gerald Ellis, uttered only one sentence, "You're grown now, Lillian. Go take care of yourself." It all happened in a matter of minutes. No one asked where I was going, if I had somewhere to sleep, or even if I had enough money for dinner. Vernon stood at the bottom of the stairs, phone in hand, filming me as I carried my bag out the door, as if it were some cruel form of entertainment. He was 3 years younger than me, the golden child in my parents' eyes. Always right, always loved, always forgiven. And me? Just a shadow on the sidelines. I walked away from the house without looking back. I feared that if I did, I'd beg. But I had promised myself I would never kneel before those who once called me a living disappointment. That night, I walked nearly 5 miles to downtown Fairview, where a 24/7 convenience store stayed open. I curled up behind an old bus stop, wrapped in a thin hoodie. The wind howled through cracks in the bricks, slicing into my skin like glass. My stomach ached with hunger, every breath burned in my chest. But I didn't cry. I couldn't. Tears would freeze before they reached my cheeks. The next day, I wandered the streets looking for a place to stay. The church was closed, the community center overcrowded. I tried getting a job at a bakery, a coffee shop. No one would hire a girl with no address, no social security number, no ID. My stomach growled so loudly that people turned to stare. That second night, I slept behind a dumpster behind McKinley's Deli. The only warmth came from the kitchen exhaust vent. My clothes smelled like grease and burnt meat, but at least I didn't freeze to death. I curled up in my coat, hugging my backpack like it held the last piece of my childhood. Every sound startled me, a car, a metal door, a barking dog. I knew I could be robbed, assaulted, or worse, but I had no other choice. On the third day, I tried getting a job at a car wash, but the manager looked me up and down and said, "We don't hire strays." I felt my face flush, but I kept my cool. I was used to being looked down upon. That night, I went back behind McKinley's, but someone else had already claimed the spot, a homeless man sleeping with an empty bottle in his arms. I didn't dare go near. I walked around to the back of a small diner called Ruby's Grill. The back door was slightly open, warm yellow light spilling out. As I peeked inside, a voice called out, "What are you doing?" I jumped. A middle-aged woman stood in front of me, curly brown hair, flour-dusted apron, holding a long-handled ladle. She didn't look at me like a stranger, she looked like she had seen me long before I ever knocked. I was speechless, but before I could turn to leave, she said, "If you're planning to sleep behind my kitchen, you might as well mop the floor first." I froze, then nodded. Her name was Ruby Delaney, owner of the diner, the first person in 3 days of hell who looked at me like a human being. Ruby didn't ask where I came from or demand answers. She handed me a mop, then gestured to a tray of chicken stir-fry noodles on the counter. "Eat first, then work." I ate every bite, then cleaned until midnight. When I finished, she pointed toward the back storage room. "There's an old mattress in the corner, not the cleanest, but better than the floor." I nodded, fighting back the tears threatening to spill. For the first time in 3 days, I had a hot meal and a place to sleep without rats. I pulled my hoodie over my head, lay down on the stiff mattress, and exhaled. I pulled my hoodie over my head, lay down on the stiff mattress, and exhaled slowly. No one knew where I was. My family was probably enjoying dinner by the fireplace, laughter echoing in their well-decorated dining room. Meanwhile, Lillian Ellis was curled up beside crates of flour and canned goods in the back of a tiny diner. But I was alive. And I wasn't going to break. The next morning, I woke to the clatter of pots and the aroma of bacon. My body ached. My hands were sore from scrubbing the night before. But for the first time in days, I had slept on something softer than concrete. What are you still lying there for? Ruby's voice rang out from the kitchen. Get up and mop the floor. Her voice was brisk, no nonsense, the kind that expected obedience, not excuses. I scrambled up, almost tripping over the blanket. She didn't scold me, though. She just tossed me a mop and nodded toward the kitchen. Work first. Eat later. And so I worked. From sunrise to closing time. I mopped floors, washed dishes, hauled boxes, and cleaned greasy surfaces that hadn't been touched in weeks. My arms burned, and my feet felt like they were on fire. But I didn't stop. I couldn't afford to. For the first time in my life, I felt useful. Each plate I washed, every table I wiped down, added a strange sense of purpose. 3 days later, Ruby handed me a faded uniform shirt and a plastic name tag. Lillian, kitchen assistant. I stared at the tag for a long time. Not because it was pretty. But because, for the first time, I had a name and a title, even if it was just 2 words printed on a cracked badge. Ruby didn't say much. She never offered compliments or sentimental speeches. But I could feel her eyes watching me, when I was sweating from carrying trays or when my hands turned red from the sink water. She never said anything. She just started leaving hand towels, gloves, and ointment nearby. You're not a bad kid, she said once, without looking up from peeling carrots. You just had to grow up a bit earlier than others. I lived at the diner for almost a year. Ruby's spare room upstairs became my home. It was cramped and smelled faintly of onions, but it had a real bed, a tiny desk, and a space heater. I worked double shifts, sometimes triple. Tips were small, but I saved every cent. I gave up everything unnecessary, no candies, no drinks, no new clothes. I even gave up sleep sometimes, just so I could afford night classes to earn my GED. I studied in the storage room during breaks, using second-hand textbooks I found at the thrift store. Some nights I fell asleep at my desk, pen still in hand. But every time I remembered my mother calling me a burden, I tightened my grip on that pen and kept writing. When I finally passed the GED, Ruby didn't celebrate loudly. She simply set a small cupcake in front of me with a lit birthday candle and said, "Congrats. Now it starts." That night, I cried quietly, not because I was sad, but because I felt alive again. I applied to Midlake Community College. It wasn't a big-name school, but it had a decent business program. I didn't want to be a dishwasher forever. I wanted to understand money, how to manage it, grow it, protect it. When my acceptance letter arrived, I stared at it for hours. I hadn't believed it was possible. Ruby, as usual, said nothing extravagant. She just handed me a spare key and pointed upstairs. The storeroom won't do anymore. You'll need a quieter place to study. I didn't know how to thank her. She never said the word family, but that tiny room above the diner, and her quiet trust, meant more to me than anything my blood relatives had ever offered. I studied during the day and worked at night. There were weeks I barely slept, juggling classes, shifts, and exams. But I didn't slow down. I wouldn't let myself. There was a quiet fire inside me. Not hatred, not exactly. More like determination. The kind that builds slowly after years of being told you're not good enough. 2 years later, I graduated near the top of my class. I wore a navy gown and a cap that trembled from the wind during the outdoor ceremony. No one from my family came. No one took pictures. But I recorded the ceremony and watched it that night in my room, over and over, whispering to myself, "You did it. You made it through." I applied for a scholarship to a respected business school in Portland, and got in. When I arrived in the city, I had $63 and a notebook full of ideas. I rented a shared room with 3 other girls and waited tables on weekends. I studied for 10 to 12 hours a day. I applied for every internship I could find. I didn't care how small the company was or if the job was unpaid. I just wanted to learn. Eventually, I landed an internship at a small health startup that specialized in nutritional supplements for cancer patients. The position came with no salary, no guarantee of a job, but I showed up every day like it was my own company. I asked questions. Took notes. Stayed late. I learned about sourcing, branding, manufacturing, logistics, and contract law. From the warehouse staff to the company founder, I listened to everyone. By the time I graduated, I had an idea that had been quietly growing inside me for years, a nutritional brand designed for people recovering from illness, surgery, diabetes, cardiac events. Something clean, reliable, trustworthy. I named it Harborwell, because to me, that's what I always wished I had, a harbor in the storm. A place to get well again. I pitched the idea to a small entrepreneurial fund, and to my surprise, they offered a starter loan. I combined it with my savings and began building the brand, box by box, label by label. I packed every order by hand. I biked across the city to deliver samples to clinics and rehabilitation centers. I live-streamed most nights, sharing stories about why nutrition mattered, especially for those too sick to speak for themselves. It took 3 years. But word began to spread. Harborwell became a name whispered in hospital rooms, recommended by dietitians, and slowly, it took off. By the time I turned 25, Harborwell was earning steady revenue, not millions, not yet, but enough to be noticed. The year after, we hit our first big milestone, a major hospital group signed a regional distribution deal. That one contract opened the door to dozens of clinics and specialist practices. We were finally gaining momentum, the kind that couldn't be stopped. When a reporter interviewed me for a feature on young entrepreneurs, he asked me what was the turning point for you. I didn't mention my parents. I didn't talk about sleeping behind a deli or mopping floors until midnight. I just smiled and said it started with a mop, and someone who didn't ask me who I was. But the past has a way of circling back. It had been nearly 9 years since I left the Ellis house. 9 years since my name had been spoken with any warmth by anyone in that family. So when an invitation to my brother Vernon's engagement party arrived at my office, I assumed it was a mistake. A white envelope, elegant calligraphy, and my full name printed clearly. Lillian Ellis. I stared at it for a long time. Not out of excitement. But because of what it represented. They remembered me now. I almost tossed it into the trash. But something made me pause. Curiosity, maybe. Closure, more likely. I RSVP'd yes. The event was held at the Ridgeline Manor Hotel, one of the most prestigious venues in the city. Crystal chandeliers, grand marble floors, a ballroom dressed in soft golds and creams. Everything glowed with an air of old wealth and perfect image. Exactly the kind of place my parents would choose to prove they'd done well with their children. I arrived exactly on time, wearing a deep sapphire gown and heels that clicked across the marble-like punctuation marks. Heads turned. But not because they recognized me. No one had seen me in nearly a decade. Not since the girl in worn-out shoes was escorted off her own front lawn with nothing but a backpack and $14. My entrance was quiet. But the silence that followed was thunderous. My mother, Margaret, spotted me first. Her smile froze mid-sip. Her wine glass tilted just enough to spill a drop onto her cream blouse. Vernon stood by the bar, engaged in conversation with a man I didn't recognize. His fiancée, Emery Caldwell, the star of the night, stood beside him, all glittering eyes and designer elegance. I waited. A few moments later, Margaret crossed the floor toward me. Her heels echoed with tension. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low, clipped, carefully restrained. "I was invited," I replied. "Vernon didn't," she paused. Of course, she hadn't actually checked. "You've made your choices, Lillian," she said tightly. "You didn't want to be part of this family. Why appear now?" I met her eyes, eyes that once refused to watch me walk out the door. "I didn't come to belong," I said softly. "I came to finish something." She gave me a forced smile and leaned in. "If you cause a scene tonight, I'm not here to ruin anything." I smiled. "I'm just here to speak the truth." Before she could respond, a voice behind her broke the moment. "Lillian?" It was Emery. She walked over, her gaze uncertain but kind. I didn't know you were Vernon's sister, she said. I've heard about you, but not much. I nodded. I'm not surprised. Vernon appeared behind her, the color draining from his face when he saw me. You're not on the guest list, he said sharply. Strange, because I got an invitation. With my name on it. His fiancée looked at him. You told me she wasn't coming. She's not, he hesitated. She's not part of this anymore. I'm not here to stay, I said calmly. I just want to share something before your life starts with a lie. I handed Emery a slim envelope, white, clean, sealed with a red stamp. She opened it cautiously. Her eyes scanned the contents, and her expression shifted, confusion, then disbelief, then something close to betrayal. What is this? She whispered. It's a transcript, I said. From Jefferson Medical College. Where Vernon claimed to graduate. She looked at him. You said you were a certified medical consultant. I am, Vernon started, but I cut in. You were enrolled. But you didn't graduate. You dropped out 2 years in. And never went back. The room had begun to hush. A few nearby guests glanced our way. Someone even stopped the music. I checked with the board, I added. They've never heard of him holding any certification. Which means the credentials listed on his employment forms at your father's clinic are inaccurate. Vernon's jaw tightened. That's enough, he said. But it wasn't. There's more, I said, reaching into my clutch and pulling out a second envelope, this one thicker. I handed it to Emery. This contains email correspondence between your father's practice and the state health department. You'll notice there's an internal note about a recent audit, and an employee who raised concerns about false billing codes. Those codes matched the ones Vernon submitted. The silence was suffocating now. Even Margaret was frozen in place, wine glass trembling slightly. You're not just lying to Emery, I said, now turning to Vernon. You're putting your entire practice at risk. Your patients. Your license. All of it, because you couldn't be honest. Emery's voice was barely audible. Is any of this true? Vernon looked down. Then at me. I tried to make something of myself, he muttered. I did what I had to do. No, I said. You did what was easy. And you assumed no one would ever come back to challenge you. I turned to my mother then, who was still gripping her glass like a lifeline. You once told me I was a burden, I said. That I'd never succeed. That I didn't belong. I was protecting your brother. No. You were silencing me. More guests had gathered now, watching from a distance. I could feel their curiosity, their judgment. But I didn't care. I wasn't there to embarrass anyone. I was there because silence was how people like Margaret Ellis kept control. And I wasn't silent anymore. Margaret's expression cracked, not with guilt, but with fear. Not because of what I had said, but because people were listening now. The illusion she had curated for years, the respectable Ellis family, polished and admired, was slipping. Emery stood with the documents in hand, silent. She looked at Vernon like she had never seen him before. You said you were licensed, she whispered. You said you were taking care of patients, advising on treatment plans. I was just helping, Vernon said defensively. I never harmed anyone. But you lied, she replied quietly. To me. To everyone. He reached for her hand, but she took a step back. You need to leave, she said to me, though her tone was calm, not cruel. I need time to think. I nodded and looked at Vernon one last time. He didn't speak. He didn't shout. He just stared at the floor like a boy caught cheating on a test he thought no one would grade. I turned to go, but Margaret stepped in front of me. Do you know what you've done? She said through clenched teeth. You've humiliated us. This family. I tilted my head slightly, almost feeling sorry for her. Family doesn't begin and end with blood, I said. You had a daughter once. And you threw her away. You could have talked to us, she began, her voice rising. I did, I said. You just didn't listen. And now, the world finally did. The room didn't erupt. There was no applause or cheering, no dramatic exits. There was only the quiet unraveling of a lie that had lived too long. I walked out of the ballroom into the cold evening air. A calm breeze brushed across my face, not sharp like the wind that cut through me all those years ago. This wind was steady. Crisp. Freeing. A car waited at the curb, headlights soft against the pavement. Nathan leaned out the window, that familiar half-smile on his face. "All done?" he asked. I nodded, sliding into the passenger seat. "Was it everything you expected?" "No," I said truthfully. "It was quieter. But that's okay." Nathan didn't need to ask why I'd gone or what I said. He had been there from the start, from the late nights of research, to the whispered doubts I couldn't shake, to the moments I almost walked away from the truth, just for peace. He was the only one who understood that I didn't want revenge. I wanted resolution. He pulled away from the curb, steering us down the hill toward the older part of the city, where the buildings leaned slightly and the bakery on Madison stayed open past midnight. "Cake?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Absolutely," I said with a quiet laugh. "Double chocolate. With strawberries this time." We parked at Grace's bakery, the scent of cinnamon and sugar drifting through the air like a welcome mat. Grace stood behind the counter, darning a sweater she probably knit 20 years ago. She looked up when she saw me. "The girl who eats chocolate cake when she's made big decisions," she said. I smiled. "Tonight, I'll take 2 slices. And a scoop of ice cream," Nathan added. Grace chuckled as she disappeared into the kitchen. We settled into our favorite booth by the window. I stared out at the quiet street, the soft hum of the streetlights, the slow rhythm of a life I built with my own hands. When the cake arrived, I didn't rush. I savored it. Every bite tasted like something I had earned. Like the sweetness of becoming whole again. "You know," Nathan said, stirring his coffee, "you didn't yell. You didn't storm out. You just told the truth." "That's all I ever wanted," I said. "To say it. And know someone finally heard." "Did it make you feel better?" I thought for a moment, then nodded. "It didn't fix what they broke. But it closed the door. And I'm ready for what's on the other side." Nathan reached across the table, resting his hand over mine. "Then welcome to your real beginning, Lillian." I looked at him, then back out the window. There were no fireworks. No sudden bursts of joy. Just peace. Real, quiet peace. The kind you only find after walking through a storm and deciding not to live there anymore. And as I sat there, the last bite of cake on my fork, the world outside soft and slow, I realized something I'd carried for years was finally gone. I wasn't the girl they abandoned. I wasn't the shame they tried to hide. I wasn't a burden. I was Lillian Ellis. And I had reclaimed my name, my story, my voice. For the first time in forever, I wasn't surviving. I was free. Thank you for watching the video. Like it if you watched the video to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.